Welcome to the Minnesota Rovers Tuesday evening presentation. Minnesota Rovers is an outdoors club based in Minneapolis, St. Paul. Our members organize trips that range from 1 hour to 2 weeks in Minnesota or further afield. Examples of our activities include hiking, biking, backpacking, skiing, snowshoeing, paddling, and rock climbing. We also organize conservation and trail clearing trips. Our members have experience and skills in many outdoor activities, so if you want to learn a new outdoor activity, we can probably help you. For more information, go to mnrovers.org. Now let's move on to this week's presentation.
Good evening, everybody. My name is David Bourne. I'm a member of the Rovers, although I've never actually done anything with you except muddle around with things. But in the interest of bringing some contribution, I decided to volunteer a friend. And so I'd like to introduce Bob Pozos. Bob and I have known each other since the 1960s when we were both graduate students at Southern Illinois University. Bob was working on a doctorate in neurophysiology, and I was working on a degree in what turned out to be anthropology and educational psychology. After we graduated, I came to Minnesota, where I worked at the University of Minnesota at the School of Dentistry, working in the area of public health. Bob went to Tennessee, where he did I believe it was a 2-year postdoc, where he was doing research into Parkinson's and tremor. And then he came to the University of Minnesota Duluth to help them get their medical school started. And while there, began doing research on hypothermia, and I'll let him get into as much of that as he wants to do so. Bob's done some really amazing and internationally known work. He's had sponsorship from, initially it was from Stearns in St. Cloud, looking at their life preservers and some of their survival suits. And then he went on and has also done work for the Department of Defense and other national science funding sources. He's a great guy, of course. I wouldn't know him if he wasn't, but right. He's really very knowledgeable, very personable, and I'm really pleased that he let me badger him into doing this presentation. The only other thing I'd say before turning it over to him is that he would welcome your questions as he's going along. Both he and I have lectured extensively, and it's always been my experience that it's better for people to ask questions when they have them, to try to remember them and wait till the very end, and then by that time they forgot it or they have to rush off. So please feel free to ask your questions, and Bob will try to answer them as we go along.
So, ladies and gentlemen, from the Minnesota Rovers group, Dave, as I mentioned, he mentioned, is a good friend of mine, and we co-wrote this book 100 years ago. And Dave basically put it inside his freezer, I think, to talk about hypothermia and what's going on here. And like he mentioned, we would just like people, if they have comments or criticisms or discussion questions, to bring them up as we're going through this, because there's a lot of information. We're not going to present a lot of it. We're going to try and keep it at a level where people can be interested in what's going on. So feel free to interject when necessary. So if I could have the next slide, Stacy. Yeah, so really, hypothermia is all about thermal regulation in the humans. And very briefly, the work that I've conducted over the years has been primarily looking at human performance in the cold. And it's really part of a huge grand area of physiology called thermal regulation, in which the body regulates its temperature regardless of whether it's too hot or too cold, and you people in Minnesota know this better than most. Okay, so we could have the next slide, please. So the next slide here, this is a fundamental point of physics, and there's a couple of points I like to make that once they're made, everything else makes a lot of sense. Otherwise, you can get lost in the minutia of this, do this, or don't do this, or do that. We're really just talking about physical bodies in a sense, and where there's a transfer of heat from one to another. And in a very simplistic way, the heat transfer involves where actually the energy goes from the hot source to the cold source. And this is fundamental: fingers, toes, inside your body, outside your body. This is exactly what we're going to be talking about. And there's a lot of physics equations that I could bore you to death with, but this is the bottom line. Okay, the next slide there. So we have to have a definition of hypothermia, and there are three compartments. That's okay, Stacy. There are three components, and you can bring up the next slide. That's fine. There are three components for us in terms of thermal regulation. There's the skin that does some thermal regulation for us. There's the muscles that actually play a role in thermal regulation. But the core for us, for survival in any kind of cold situation, is what's occurring in the core. And the core really refers to the temperatures of the thorax and the brain. This is the definition. When somebody says, well, he's hypothermic or she's hypothermic, the first thing I ask is, did you take a temperature? What do you know what the temperature is? Well, they were cold to the touch. That's good. That means their skin was cold. Or their legs or their toes. What's going on with their core? Because the core will determine eventually whether or not the person will survive or whatever. Now, real briefly here, the real question comes up, well, how do you really accurately measure core temperature? And the answer, the bottom line on this, core temperature is best measured most accurately by way of rectal thermocouples. The rectum is the best way to go. And if you had a chance, if you wanted to, you could have somebody swallow a pill, and the pill goes to the stomach, and the stomach gastrointestinal temperature is also a good example of core. All the other measurements of temperature really have their problems. I'd like to bring up the one dealing with the ear. Everybody says, well, we can do tympanic temperature. Yes, you can, but tympanic temperature does not record core temperature. It records the temperature of your face. And if you wanted to see this, just take ear thermometer, put it in the ear, and they put a cold compress on that side of the face, and the temperature will go down. Or put a hot compress there, and the temperature will go up. So tympanic temperatures that are used all over really are not an indication of core temperature. There's axillary temperature, which is also underneath the armpit. You can forget about that one real quick. That one doesn't work either because people don't put it on. They might have more fat, less fat, more muscle, etc. And it's not an indication of core. Oral temperature is really not recommended because for one reason, you're breathing in and out, and most people do not keep their mouth shut when they're trying to do oral temperatures. And in some cases, they can actually bite the thermometer. Take home message, core temperature, core is really rectal, would be the best, or esophageal. And we do realize in field situations, this is not practical many times. We've done a lot of work with military operations where they're very concerned about cold performance of military personnel and when they get cold, et cetera, et cetera. So the practical point is on a lot of issues dealing with what maybe you're going to be doing as you're out there roaming the wilderness of Minnesota is you might just have to just take a good look at that person and get some idea and go actually by a hunch, because don't spend your time trying to get a thermometer, in their mouth or trying to do anything else because it's counterproductive in the outdoors. So there's your temperatures, and there's how you measure them. Okay, Stacy, I'll take the next slide. So here we go. So what are the classifications of hypothermia? Core temperature has to fall. Normally, you sitting around listening to me and me talking and Dave over there, we usually run somewhere around 37 degrees centigrade. And most of these measurements we talk about are usually in centigrade, but the 98.6 is up there as well. A 2-degree drop in core temperature, again, I emphasize core temperature, is actually mild hypothermia. And this is where most people spend a lot of time, and they should. I mean, when you're outside, if your body is sensing cold, there's going to be shivering, there's going to be your blood vessels to your skin are going to close down, you're going to have vasoconstriction, and you're going to have stress hormones being released. The point I would like to make here, and this should have been first in the slide when I put it together, is behavior changes are amongst the first to occur in mild hypothermia. Behavior changes. In other words, and actually many military operations really look at it very practically. So you have a group of people out there chattering around, there's cold weather operations, wherever it is, and what they look for is the person who is usually quiet begins to talk a lot. And the person who's talkative begins to go quiet. They all of a sudden you see a personality change, a behavior change. That behavior change is critical. And if you see it in 1 or 2 members of your party, you stop. You don't go on because they're your canaries. They're telling you that these individuals, for whatever reason, are in some stage of mild hypothermia. And it's not going to kill you to be in mild hypothermia. You can actually do quite a bit of functioning, whatever it is, but you have to be careful that it's really indicating that the party or you involved, if you're by yourself, there's something going on that you need to immediately address. Otherwise, the whole party is in jeopardy. And so that's mild hypothermia. And behavior changes. This is what I think Stacy was talking about, getting together after the Zoom meeting, having a social group. The recommendation we always had is get to know your partner. You better know them, because if some kind of change is going to occur, that behavior change is better than any thermometer in the market. All right. This goes for both heat as well as cold. And then, so there's mild. You're out there in Lake Superior battling around, and all these things, all these mechanisms are working. I'll talk about those in a minute. But if the temperature continues to go down, you now enter into, Stacy, the next slide, which is moderate hypothermia right here. And moderate hypothermia is muscle rigidity, loss of manual dexterity, and it's extreme. You can end up actually passing out. Okay, and this is where you usually find a lot of people. I was telling Stacy, I've been involved in court cases, been involved with DOD in terms of some of these issues and looking at, is the person in mild hypothermia or moderate? You can't tell unless you do a thermometer reading, but if their muscle is rigid, they cannot function too well, they cannot talk. Basically, you look like they're drunk or unconscious. They're in moderate hypothermia. And finally, if this continues, the core temperature, now we're just talking core temperature, folks. If the core temperature continues to fall, you then go into severe hypothermia, which I think is the next slide. Yep, there it is. The next slide shows severe hypothermia. This is one of the blessings and one of the curses of hypothermia. The reason it's a blessing is if you're cold, that doesn't mean that that the organs no longer are going to function. They're in a certain kind of state, I'm going to use the term loosely, of hibernation. And so they've stopped almost completely functioning, but they've not been damaged. And the emphasis is on the word they've not been damaged. And so the issue with severe hypothermia, been many cases of people surviving, and I can give you a couple of cases in a minute, but the end result of the heroic efforts of the physiological system is if it doesn't work and the core temperature stays down for a long period of time, if the person dies, the person dies due to cardiovascular failure. It's the heart that goes. And everybody wants to worry about, well, is it this, the arms? Nope, nope, it is the ticker that actually goes. And so that's, on one hand, you can obviously die from hypothermia. On the other hand, you have a good chance of survival, even if you're in severe hypothermia. And so the point we used to make to everybody, sort of a joke, is, if you had to choose which way you wanted to die, in hypothermia or hyper. Hyper, when the core temperature goes up 3 to 5 degrees, in hyperthermia, you only have minutes to survive in severe hyperthermia. On the other hand, with severe hypothermia, you have a much longer period of time, sometimes stretching into the hours. So this is just indicating the difference of the survivability of the organ systems that we have. Okay, I'm going to stop there for a minute. Is everybody okay? Are there any questions? Are we doing okay? Stacy, talk to me.
Bob, I can, while people are thinking, just throw out a case study. Bob mentioned that I helped him write the book. I have done quite a bit of magazine work, and in the 1980s, I had the chance to interview a farmer down around Rochester who was 80 years old. He had had a hip injury, broken hip 3 years earlier, but he was still actively farming. And he went out one night to check on his cattle. It was 10 below, pretty high winds. Make a long story short, he slipped on the ice, lost his walker, couldn't get to the barn, and he lay out on the ice for over 15 hours. His body temperature, when his brother came to check on him, his core temperature was above 70, but not very much above it. The EMT crew that arrived to pick up what they thought was probably a dead man noticed a pulse, but they said the man's body was like a slab of meat that they had to wrap pieces of towel around his legs to be able to get a grip on it. Body was so hard. But they took him to a hospital in Rochester, and they happened to treat him the right way. And an hour after they got him in, he's regained consciousness. So as Bob said, you can be pretty cold for a pretty long time and still survive.
Right. Okay. So moving on, I suppose, Stacy, if I could have the next slide. There's a couple of misnomers that always get me going in a tizzy. It's been in the field too long. Hypothermia, as we say, is a drop in core temperature, but hypothermia is not freezing. You hear this all the time. The person froze to death, right? Well, freezing by definition is when the blood vessels, the blood really turns to ice. Okay, hypothermia is not an ice situation. You can have ice as your limbs be frozen, but really the issue here is freezing to death is a misnomer. Hypothermia really just means death due to exposure in which the core temperature falls. Frostbite, people have, in giving these talks, they've talked about, I had hypothermia because, I had frostbite on my feet, my toes, whatever. And again, I was frozen. Well, frostbite can be frozen peripheral tissue, but that's not hypothermia. And the latest one that's out there is called non-freezing cold injury. Non-freezing cold injury is really something that has been known, in which what happens, let's say you have a knee surgery or something like that, and after the knee surgery, they put around the surgical site a cooling device. And the cooling device sends cold water through the applicator to cool, let's say, the knee. The issue with that kind of approach is if it is kept on too long without intervention or people looking at it, what happens is that the cold water in that delivery system will cool down the nerves and blood vessels at the site and cause injury to the surgical site. And it's called non-freezing cold injury. And it's somewhat similar to trench foot, in which trench foot is really prolonged exposure to cold water, like on the feet, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a number of terms out there, but hypothermia is none of those dealing with freezing at all. So there we go.
I did have a question on your last slide. You'd mentioned cortisone or adrenaline release and that kind of thing. Does that cause symptoms that might be recognizable that someone's in hypothermia, or something? This adrenaline seems like they'd be hyper, or does that just add confusion, or what's the result there?
Well, the adrenaline and I think I'll show you this in another slide, but it's a great question. So when you have this cold stress, you're out there and you're having this cold stress, and all of a sudden you're beginning to shiver. Your entire body goes into defense mode to prevent hypothermia, and adrenaline is secreted. And adrenaline is secreted in many ways to really increase the metabolism of the body. In addition to that, it might play a role with other organ systems as well. But that's one of its major functions, is to just really ramp up all the physiological systems to generate heat. Okay.
Another question?
Okay.
There's a question from Jay.
Oh, that must be me, Julie.
Yeah.
Thank you. If you happen to fall into Lake Superior, say, and it's 50-degree temperatures, how long can you exist if you're in the lake at 50-degree temperatures without your body dropping, the core temperature dropping significantly? So in other words, how long can you survive, I guess is what I'm asking.
Yep, no, that's in fact, I was telling Stacy earlier when we started up at the medical school, the hypothermia lab, when I was talking to the local people up in Duluth, Minnesota, the question always came up, well, that we were doing the work up there, and they said, well, Lake Superior, if you fall into Lake Superior, you only have about 5 minutes to survive. And I said, really? I said, no, that doesn't make sense. Even as cold as the water is, if you take a look at the thermodynamics of the human body and heat transfer, et cetera, you have more than that. And so we did extensive studies looking at medical students in cold water. And this was really the forte of our lab. And the fundamental bottom line is, number one, if you're physically fit and you fall into Lake Superior, you have at least 15 to 20 minutes before you're into mild hypothermia. All right, so that's the begin. Like I said, that would be mild hypothermia, depending upon how fat you are, how physically fit you are, how much you thrash around. And even there with mild hypothermia, you can still be in the water. And as you get colder, you'll go into moderate hypothermia. But notice you're not dead yet. And you can stay in there. And again, it depends upon whether you have a life jacket on, a whole bunch of other factors before you end up with severe hypothermia. What kills most of the people who fall into Lake Superior or any body of cold water is primarily what they call the aspiration reflex, where if you fall into the water and you take a deep, notice when you can take a deep breath, and as you take the deep breath, you really swallow the water. You actually aspirate the water, and this is what actually causes you to drown. It can either be that, or you don't have a life jacket on and you begin to swim a little bit, but the hypothermia is not going to be the instantaneous killer. It's going to be more than likely aspiration of water into the lungs that basically kills the person rather than anything else. So Lake Superior, physically fit individual, mild hypothermia, 15 to 20 minutes, moderate hypothermia, maybe up to an hour, depending upon factors. And then severe hypothermia, again, depending on other factors, you can go a little bit longer, like maybe up to 2 hours.
And at some point in there, do you feel sleepy? I'm thinking of the movie The Titanic, where what's his name is in the water holding onto an iceberg.
Right. That's one of the signs. That's actually the beginnings of moderate hypothermia. Is some people do experience, like I mentioned, they're drunk, right? And so you're sort of sleepy. You're losing your consciousness. And the only thing that really interests me is some of these movies and all this other stuff. They have the poor person in the water and he's falling asleep due to going into moderate hypothermia. And they're over there saying, okay, just think through it. Okay, think warm. Well, I think that's a great idea, but you're talking here physics. Okay, you got cold water and you got your body generating heat, and it's not going to work just to think it through. Positive thinking does not help in those situations.
Great, thank you.
You're
Thanks very
welcome.
much.
Yep. Okay, Stacy, are we on to the next slide here? So here we're going to go through a physiology.
I got a quick question.
Yep.
What are the current high points for slow versus fast rewarming?
Oh, you're going all the way to the end of my lecture, but that's okay.
Let's wait till then.
Well, it depends. How much time do I have? Because you asked a really great question. So, Stacy, how much time do I have so I can moderate what I have to present here? Because I do want the questions.
I would say 10 after 8.
Okay, so it's 7:46 your time?
Yeah, maybe another
Okay.
25 minutes, but we're not going to because it's quite fascinating.
Yeah, no, but I just want to make sure that the speaker, and that's really a tremendously good question. And we'll get to it then. So I'll make sure we have enough time on that. So let's go through the regulation of core temperature, because that then begins to answer or set the basis for answering a tremendous number of questions that have come up concerning hypothermia and what to do. So if we could have the next slide. What I like to do, so I don't scare people away with looking at complex physiological diagrams, is to present the human body more like a house. And this is something that we can all relate to, and it's pretty straightforward. If you take a look at this house right here, it has thermal sensors, right, that are inside the house and outside, just like we have thermostats, right? We have a thermostat in our house. The body has many temperature sensors. They're on the periphery, they're inside, and these send signals back to a computer in the brain, which is really the key thermostat. So you got these thermal sensors, send the signal down to the brain, down here at the bottom, and this thermostat then does a comparison. And this comparison is the one that becomes important, because if the thermostat in the brain basically says it's getting cold out there, the skin, the temperature of the periphery is getting cold relative to the internal temperature of the house, it will generate more heat. It will cause the secretion of adrenaline and many of the hormones. So it's a sensory signal that goes from the skin, and it compares it to the core, and this is all done normally. It's even happening in you right now. A fun example, if you ever want to see this, and I'm sure you've all done this, is we used to sometimes induce shivering by having people drink cold, very cold ice drinks, right? And I'm sure you've done that yourself. You can take something very cold, and if you drink it and going down, you can actually induce shivering in people. Why is that? Because the brain is sensing now that the internal temperature is colder than the skin. And so it's going to begin to generate shivering and other things that's going on. So the point I'm trying to make is skin temperature versus core temperature, they're being sensed by this computer. This computer is set at 37 degrees C or thereabouts, and it can change. And this is one of the big controversies in physiology. what is the set point, meaning what is the temperature? Well, it's around 37. It's found in the brain, but certain drugs, interestingly enough, can change the set point. So many of the drugs that we're not going to get into a lot of detail that people take can change the set point, which then changes everything else that happens relative to thermal regulation. So sensors on the skin, inside, going down to the computer. Then the computer then does something very interesting. The set point in the brain then turns on, or actually doesn't turn on, but modifies the heat being generated. You see there, just like you have in Minnesota, you got your big furnace there, and that furnace then is already on. It will increase, and it will then distribute that heat to all the radiators that are in this house. The radiators in the house are the same thing as your blood vessels throughout your body. And so in this case, the blood is going to be warmed up, and in the internal core, that blood is going to be going to your internal organs. And at the same time, and it was hard for me to put this in here, and at the same time, the blood vessels to the skin or to the outside of the house are going to close down. They're going to close down because you do not want to lose any heat at all to the external environment. So you'll get what they call a vasoconstriction. So temperature regulation really involves the nervous system, and it also involves very much the cardiovascular system working together along with endocrine systems that then secrete different kinds of hormones to enhance the system. Okay, so that's the nutshell of it. And then I think we'll go to the next one here, Stacy. Is this the next slide? There you go. You can see why I didn't want to show this slide, guys. To me, this slide is one that's designed to cause students to fall asleep or to leave the classroom, you know, because it is not doing anything any differently. I put these numbers here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, because what the body wants to do is it wants to keep that core temperature at 37. And if you take a look, it is all integrated here at number 1. The thermal signals come in, they go to the brain. The brain then has systems in which it sends signals to the sweat glands, it sends signals to the muscles, and it sends signals to the blood vessels, and it sends signals to the endocrine glands. All of these are working together, and there's beautiful feedback mechanisms all going on as the body is trying to keep that core temperature at around 37 degrees. Okay? But each one of these, what makes it interesting is each one of these points can be impaired. And if they're impaired, then you're going to have thermal regulation problems. So regretfully, in the case like muscles over here, well, muscles are tensed and you shiver, and that's how you generate heat. Beautiful. What happens if you have a physical condition in which you have some kind of muscle problem? So up in Duluth, regretfully, in one case, a patient who had spinal cord problems, he went to a hockey game, came on out, it was, I don't know, 20 below in Duluth or something, and he basically died of hypothermia in his truck, because when we saw him in the lab, he had no muscles and he wasn't able to generate any kind of shivering response at all. So I'm just bringing these out. We could spend a month discussing the different kinds of problems people face, you know, if the system is not working properly. Okay, next slide, Stacy. So here we go. This really is what you people do all the time. I think when you're out there cross-country skiing, snowshoeing, or whatever, this is what you do. What primarily, if you take a look at this equation right here, you're looking at, and we'll go through these, you want to keep the core temperature right there, S, at around 37. Well, that's going to depend upon your metabolic rate. Okay, what's your metabolic rate? How much heat are you generating? Are you a young 22-year-old female who's in physically good shape? when it's generating heat, you barely touch them and they're nice and warm? Or are they some older person, who's in their 80s or something, who are not as warm, that they might have a lower metabolic rate and they're not generating as much heat? How much physical work is going on at that time? You're out there snowshoeing, you're getting hot and hot and hot, but in some cases, people are not able to generate that kind of heat because the snowshoeing might be okay for some people, but for others, it's not going to work. So they're not going to generate that much heat. And then the big one that a good friend of mine, Art Ofterheide, who used to be up at the medical school in Duluth, told me when he would take me out to educate this Southern California newbie about temperature regulation in the cold. We would go on snowshoeing trips, cross-country trips in the snow up there in Duluth. His point of view was, and it's actually part of military jargon now, you don't go into the cold overdressed. The big mistake that many people make is it's cold, you're warm, you walk out there and you have on all this clothing, and then you begin to do physical exercise, and then you start taking the clothing off or you begin to sweat. So sweating, evaporative heat loss here, is a huge problem in the military because the people are sweating, they have backpacks on, et cetera, and they need a tremendous amount of water. And so sweat is not your friend in this case. It's cooling down the body, but at the same time, the cold air, whatever, can go in there and cool down the person as well. And so it becomes a really complicated issue of how you interact with your body relative to sweat. And to minimize that sweat usually means that you have to go out there dressed a little less comfortably, is the way Art used to say it. And when I was out there, I felt miserable. I was shaking all over, but actually within 20 minutes or so, I was fine. But I'm sure some of you have gone through this and you know this better than I do. Then the physical factors, we're going to get into these, that determine heat loss or heat gain, that are used for losing heat and also gaining heat, are radiation, convection, and conduction. We're going to go through each one of these. But what's important about them is they can also be used to warm you. They're not just there so that they can cool you off. Okay, the next slide there, Stacy. So I mentioned sweating and I mentioned overdressing, and they are just huge issues. I think about this all the time also when you have the marathon, Grandma's Marathon up there in Duluth, or some that you have down in the cities. A lot of the runners, very skinny, not too much muscle, not too much fat on them, et cetera. On a nice Minnesota day, it's okay. On a cold Minnesota day, it's not the best thing, especially for these skinny runners. But the secret to this is make sure it's not too long. And I just want to bring out another point that has always been some controversy. It's whether or not these aluminum blankets that when you get through with a race really are that effective in terms of why you put them on. And you see this with everybody. The data on this is sort of pretty messy. And the reason it's pretty messy is when people have these aluminum sheets on their bodies, they just have it around their shoulders. You got the wind still coming underneath the blanket and all that. And whether or not it's really effective or not in terms of minimizing heat loss after a marathon has always been one of the great questions of exercise physiology. Okay, that's evaporative heat loss. Okay. This is a big one that we were involved in, actually a court case a couple of years ago, which really dealt with a motorcycle person that when he went to the emergency, he was in an accident, he was in the emergency room, they took him in there, and he was in moderate hypothermia in Southern California. He was on a motorcycle bike. It was a cool day. He had an extensive long trek with his motorcycle. He didn't have on any of the leather chaps or any of the leather jackets or anything else. But as we all know, wind is a huge problem. So the motorcycle person actually was generating a tremendous amount of wind, convection. And this is the same thing that happens, as you all know, when you're up there in Minnesota and they're talking about the wind chill factor. The wind chill factor is nothing more than an expression of the convection of the heat loss due to the wind at that time. And we can get more into that wind chill factor if you want to, but there's convection. You can use convection to warm you. If you have a fan and it's hooked up to a heat source, it will warm you very nicely. Okay, next one.
It looks like Judy has a question.
Judy, go for it.
Yes, I'm wondering if you will be considering or covering people getting acclimated to the heat or the cold. I lived in Minnesota year-round for 30 years. Now I live in Florida, and my tolerance for cold is far less. In fact, I was on an outdoor event that I could have sworn the temperature was 40 or 45, and I get back in my car and the car temperature says it's 59 degrees, and I was shivering, having been in Florida for a number of years now. And the Miami people will come up to Central Florida and they'll wear a down jacket if it's 68.
Well, yeah, we see that even here in San Diego. You know, you see these people coming from Minnesota. They got on a pair of walking shorts and a t-shirt, and it's a breeze coming off of the ocean, and it's maybe about, I don't know, 40, 50 degrees, something like that. And my wife and I are over there. We said, what's wrong with these people? They're crazy. Well, there's no question that acclimatization actually does work, and you just mentioned it. And it's a fascinating area dealing with, okay, how long does it take for you now if you really wanted to get acclimated back to the cold, et cetera, et cetera. The rule of thumb is if you're constantly exposed to a warm temperature, you will lose your ability to handle the cold as much as you would if you were in Minnesota. But the good news is you are now hypersensitive to that cold loss. So that should be a warning sign to you to take care of you and your surroundings. The recent data by the military has always been interesting. How can they acclimatize young men and women who are, say, you get some kids from Florida, from New Mexico, Minnesota, and they're all going on a cold weather operation somewhere in the world. And the data that is out there is usually if you're able to get the core temperature to go down a little bit, minor decrease in core temperature over a number of days will increase your resistance to some of the initial responses to the cold. It's a very interesting, complex area, and we could spend, like I said, about a good 2 hours on it, but maybe I answered your question.
Good enough.
Okay, so this is a system that we used when we did most of our hypothermia experiments. We did our work where we had medical students actually in cold water tanks. And the reason we use cold water tanks is, number one, we were able to get the cold water from Lake Superior, which was fine. And number two, it's harder to cheat if you're in cold water because the cold water gets into every aspect of your body. The other methods that we tried, everybody tries to minimize heat loss by going into fetal positions, et cetera, et cetera. So heat loss in cold water is a beautiful example of conduction. We use water. It could be, regretfully, a person falling asleep on a cold sidewalk. That could also that's conduction as well. Any kind of surface to surface connection, but water takes heat from your body so much faster, something like on the order of 15 to 20 times faster, than other methods. And so this is the method that we used to get our medical students mildly hypothermic. I'll just mention everything was approved by the ethics board. We had a physician there all the time. We never lost a person. It was really a very intense time for me because I was worried about them. But everything turned out okay. So that's heat loss due to conduction. All right, let's get to the next slide here because I'm concerned about time. Yep. Well, folks, I mentioned the kinds that there are many kinds of hypothermia. And by that, we just have given them different definitions. So you have exposure. That's some of you folks, the rover group, you're out there cross-country skiing, snowshoeing or something, and it is the environment that basically is the main culprit that's taking the heat from your body. There are drugs that you can take that will alter thermal regulation, that will alter your set point. And there are good ones and there are bad ones. But let me bring out the one that's always mentioned is, well, if I drink alcohol, will that cause me to become hypothermic? Well, it depends upon how much alcohol you drink. If it's one drink, that's not a problem in terms of thermal regulation. It might be a problem in terms of you doing something untoward because you might not be thinking as well, but it's not going to alter your thermal regulation problems. It's going to alter your ability to make decisions. So you shouldn't be drinking and driving cars, anything. And in the cold, people say they want to warm up, so they go take 1 or 2 shots or a couple of beers. And that basically is not going to induce hypothermia and keep the blood vessels open, because the cold's going to keep them shut. But I want to emphasize it. Don't have alcohol on board in any of these outdoor situations, because in the cases we've been involved in, regretfully, many of the people who passed away from hypothermia did so because of just inappropriate decision-making, nothing to do with their physiology. Clinically, hypothermia is your buddy. When you're doing coronary artery surgical studies, not studies, but operations, what they do is they cool down the patient. And in cooling down, actually not the patient, but the heart, so that the heart now is in a protective state, and they're able to do different kinds of surgical procedures on the heart when they're taking care of the patient. So there's clinically induced hypothermia, that can, we can talk about that a lot. It's fascinating, but here's where hypothermia is your friend. This is where the clinicians come in and use it to the advantage of the patient. Okay, and then another kind of hypothermia is really the one that is very big concern, is the one dealing with geriatrics. As we get older, our ability to generate heat in some people seems to be compromised. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be just their age. It could be the underlying physiology dealing with cardiovascular system, respiratory system, neural systems, etc. But a lot of people in nursing homes and other places end up having cold core temperatures, not due to the external environment, but just due to their physiology. Little kids, pediatrics, on the other hand, children, because of their surface area to volume ratio, get cold very fast. And one has to be very, very careful about little kids because of that anatomical relationship that then induces or causes them to get cold very quick. So little kids have to be protected just like old people in terms of these kinds of problems with hypothermia. Okay, there's much more to talk about there, and there's books written on it, great articles, but I'll leave it at that for right now. Okay, next slide, Stacy. One of the biggest advances, I think, since I started in hypothermia and all that has really been the advances in terms of insulation. What you're trying to do is minimize that cold, environmental cold getting to you, and I'm sure everybody who's listening to this, who's been involved with the rovers, knows about different kinds of suits, different kinds of material, those that breathe more, those that let the sweat go out. And this is an industry that ballooned, just exploded in the 30 years that I was involved with hypothermia, whether it was gloves for the military, because you had to have certain kinds of gloves to handle computers as well as rifles and guns. And then you also had to think a lot about this, but it's a great area. And this is where I'd like to make a little pitch for FAT. So insulation, that is good. This is one place where I can say unequivocally, if you have a little bit of belly fat or whatever, thank goodness, because that's a good insulator for you. If you're physically fit, this will actually minimize the heat transfer from the cold water or cold air to your core. I'm not saying that being fat is physiologically the best thing in the world, but in this situation here, it's very good. You take a look at people who live in cold climates, such as up at Point Barrow, where I went once and met with the Eskimo people up there. They're all heavy people. And they have to be. It's a rigorous, vigorous environment that's just tough. And they've adapted to it in terms of fat being something good. Okay, the next slide. Well, I think I went through how, I think most of you already know about this, but I just want to bring it up because this is where it makes common sense. And I think all of you who've been involved in trying to get people to go backpacking or whatever know about it. But it's interesting to me that these are the situations we've been called on to address, whether the person is hypothermic or not, or et cetera, et cetera. I think the biggest one in terms of when people end up with mild, moderate, or severe hypothermia is number 3. You know, the person or persons, they go out, they give no notification to anybody about where they're going, and they just take off. And then all of a sudden they're in a situation where they're becoming mildly hypothermic. They've lost direction, they've gotten whatever. There's a multitude of problems associated with number 3, and they have no way of notifying anybody. And tragically, this is the biggest problem. Yes, you got to be in good physical condition. You shouldn't have any drugs on board. You know, those are other issues that come in. But as a rule of thumb, what we found out in the cases we've been involved in is right there. So when you go on a trip, on a tour or something, make sure you tell someone somewhere where you're going, when you're going to be back, et cetera, et cetera. I can't emphasize how simple that communication point is and how tragic it's been in the cases we've been involved in. Okay, end of sermon on that. And the next one, Stacy. I'm sure, okay, here we go. For the person who wants the rewarming, rewarming is a very complicated issue. It's complicated because it depends upon the degree of hypothermia you're in, mild, moderate, or severe. In mild hypothermia, where you're still able to be walking around, looking around, et cetera, exercising, walking, drinking hot soups, hot chocolate, et cetera, is basically all you're going to need if you're physically fit. And this is what we did with the medical students. If they were mildly hypothermic, they were at 35 degrees, which we were allowed to get to with the ethics committee. Then what you could do is once they came out of the tank, we would give them, hot chocolate. We'd have them walk back and forth. We had maybe 1 or 2 incidences where they didn't feel too good, but we saw, conservatively, I don't know, over 100 medical students, and we never had any untoward problems because it was mild hypothermia. Walk them around, give them hot fluids, and it's amazing how you could tell as soon as they began to warm up, they began to talk, and their eyes became brighter, and everything was going good. And the hot chocolate with the sugar was just tremendous. It really worked well. One point I want to mention, though, is what we liked about these studies with the medical students is we'd see them that week or the following week, and I'd ask them, anything else we should know? And what they said is something very common, is that people who do recover from these situations, they still feel cold for the next couple of days or week. The person says, they would say, yeah, I'm fine. I'm not hypothermic or anything, but God, I still feel cold. I feel cold, chilled to my bones. And we were never able to address what was causing that, but that's a common finding when you do the rewarming. The rewarming gets more difficult when you're not looking at the moderate to the severe, because remember, the big issue is the cardiovascular system. And one of the points I should mention here, I should have put in big blazing letters, is so you're going along the trail and then all of a sudden you see out to the side somebody, or you discover a hypothermic victim, obviously not conscious, over there a little bit rigid. What do? Okay, and the bigger problem really isn't just the heat, it's their cardiovascular system. The $64,000 question is, should you start CPR? Right? And the data on that is very, very mixed, because on one hand, if you start thumping on the chest on a cold heart, you run the risk of inducing ventricular fibrillation. The heart now is cold. What degree of cold, we don't know. But once you start thumping on the chest, you have to be careful that once you start it, you can't stop it. Of course, you guys know that's true for anything dealing with CPR, but in the case of the cold, that's one situation. And the issue has always been, should we rewarm him or her, or shall we take them the way they are to a place where they can get safely rewarmed and monitor the physiological signals? It is best to take them to a place where it can be where they can monitor the physiological systems and get him warm. To try and do something in the field without really sophisticated monitoring systems is begging for trouble. And of course, it depends. I mean, if you're in Minneapolis someplace, and it's maybe you can take the person to one of the hospitals there, that's one thing. If you're up in northern Minnesota where there's no hospitals around and you're on the road and you're looking at each other and you say, I don't know what to do here, that's a different situation. It is a judgment call, but you have to be careful that CPR is a big issue. One of the big, I'm always asked this, is, well, if somebody's cold, why don't we just do body-to-body rewarming? Does that work? And ladies and gentlemen, it does not work. Don't even try it. And the reason it doesn't work is because if the person is cold, the core temperature is cold, all you're doing with your body is warming it, warming the surface. If you wanted to do body-to-body rewarming, and the military tried this some time ago, we were superficially involved in the studies years ago, is you take 4 people or 5, get them all running in place, get them all hot, and you encircle them around the hypothermic victim, and you put blankets over those, the ones that are around the individual, to get that person warm. Do you imagine the logistics to try and get that done in the field? It's crazy. It's very difficult, and I applaud the military for trying to come up with something to keep them warm. There's hot air devices where you can take a hot air system that's humidified and actually give that to the person, and you can rewarm their core that way. There's multiple machines out there for rewarming in the field. There's tons of them for rewarming in hospitals, and it really depends upon how fast you rewarm the patient and how you look at the cardiovascular system. I'm going to stop here to answer the question the gentleman had. Do you have any more questions about rewarming, or did I answer it for you? Excuse me. Whoever it was.
It was Christopher.
Yes, well, I think not much has changed in the views on slow versus fast rewarming. I know that I looked at it from the standpoint of backcountry travel and then with ski patrol, rescue type things. So I look mostly at slow rewarming and keeping in mind of not to exceed a temperature rise of 1 degree an hour, preferably lower, and insulating extremities.
Right.
So you don't get a rush of electrolytes back into the system. The hospital stuff, that the talk on that could go on for hours. Huh. But
Exactly.
so I think the thing that causes the most concern for people is finding somebody who's hypothermic and you're in a situation where you're not in a good position to do something about it.
Right.
So that's, education part there. Once I get to the hospital, everybody was really relieved and hope they know what they're doing. So that's my comments on that.
Right. And I'd like to mention too, the last point for the audience here is one of the more interesting aspects of rewarming deals with the fact that as you begin to rewarm the subject, the core temperature falls. I'll say that again. You're rewarming the subject and the core temperature continues to fall. It's called afterdrop. So the person's no longer in a cold situation and they're trying to rewarm him and the afterdrop occurs. Why that occurs is not really clear. There's some interesting ideas about it, but the important point is what the concern is if it drops too much, it might also cause some more cardiovascular problems. So the reason, like you say, once you're in the field, that's a difficult situation. That's like I harped on the whole idea of the cases where there were situations like that, really were ones in where nobody knew where anybody was. There was no communication about who was going where, what they were going to do. And so you end up with these tragic situations. Usually if you're with a group of people, usually these situations, I underscore, usually do not occur, but it's a major problem. Okay, so rewarming is, don't do body-to-body rewarming. And I saw one on television where some fellow was caught in a blizzard somewhere in the plains, and what he did, or somebody, they shot a bison or something, and they eviscerated, took out all the guts so that the person could get inside the thorax of this eviscerated bison so he could stay warm enough so he wouldn't die of the blizzard. There are cases of this in the real West, but the problem is what happened is that they found a corpse inside the buffalo. The reason is that cold actually caused the joints and the muscles of the bison to actually freeze and close up. And in addition to that, the support or barrier from the bison was not that great. It's a great story. I saved myself by going inside the abdomen of a big animal and saved myself from severe hypothermia. The physics behind that are a little questionable. Okay, Stacy, the next slide, I think. Okay, I think I think you sound like a knowledgeable audience. You understand the difference between these peripheral versus core temperature measurements. If I could have the next slide. Yeah, I'm sure you're aware of this, but to me, it's the most fascinating thing is that here's the person who's in a cold chamber. We have an infrared camera. One hand is in a glove, and one hand is not. And you can tell how the body is able to actually segment heat loss to the periphery. It's a magnificent system that goes on all the time. So and it's beautifully engineered. Okay, next slide, Stacy. This is what usually happens to most people when they go out outside before they get hypothermia. They usually get some kind of cold nip, frostbite type 1, frostbite type 2, frostbite type 3. Depends upon the kinds of gloves they wear, the kind of exercise they're doing. I'm sure some of you might have seen this with some of your friends or whatever. Graphically, the biggest problem with this is people don't usually like to complain and mention that they're ending up with frostbite. And in this case of extreme frostbite, as I mentioned before, you do have the tips of the fingers actually freezing. That's not, the core temperature is still fine in this individual. This individual is not hypothermic at all. It has frostbite of you can take a look of the fingers. and not of the thumb. So whatever he or she was doing was such that the cold exposure really basically caused ice crystal formation. And again, if you want to get into a real interesting area, is the rewarming of people who have frostbite. And the rewarming in these situations, many times it is extremely painful as the warm blood rushes back on in to take care of the frozen tissue. Okay, next slide. Yeah, and these are just the different kinds of frostbite. And again, the biggest issue has always been that people are reluctant to talk about the discomfort that they have when they're outdoors. They do not, for some reason, want to bring it up because they're embarrassed or whatever, and that usually causes more and more problems than anything else. Communication is the key issue for minimizing frostbite in any of these conditions. Okay. Stacy, next slide. Yeah, a couple of myths, a couple of other fun myths here. You can see here on the left-hand side somebody floating with a PFD, personal flotation device, and Dave mentioned Stearns, one of our first benefactors. We did a lot of work with them and learned a lot about how people try and survive or actually not use PFDs. Many of the cases involving water hypothermia, the person never had on a PFD. It's really all this great research we're doing, but if you don't have a PFD, you're in trouble. There was an idea that if you take a look, you have 4 or 5 people together in the cold water, trying to keep warm, waiting till the magic occurs. This method does not work. This method does not work because you have these people together and everybody says, oh, this is great. My body is warming your body. Well, each body is vasoconstricting, and at the same time, you're moving around, so the water is getting into every crevice and every place you're at. It is not a good way to do it, number one. And number two, to try and do this, we have people trying to do it. You have to be a very good swimmer, a very good floater, or have something there to do that. This is not trivial at all. Okay, so don't do that. Then, of course, Minnesota is because my wife Annette is Finnish, and I know all about the saunas that are involved. The point being about the sauna and how good it is for you, and is it bad for you to go into the cold water and all that? It basically, what the sauna does is it causes a peripheral vasodilation of the blood vessels to the skin. So you're nice and red and toasty and warm, and you can go jump in that cold water and not feel any discomfort for at least 3 to 5 minutes, depending upon how acclimated you are, or whatever. And it's not only the Finnish population, but this is an old way of taking care of problems or whatever, but the sauna is a very safe system to use, as long as, again, you're not over there drinking too much or do something untoward, but from a physiological point of view, this is perfectly safe. Okay, next one. And so we're coming to the close, pretty much a little bit over here. And I just really want to thank the volunteers at the medical students there at UMD Medical School when we were getting started. They were great people, great kids. I call them kids. They're all, older now. But sometimes we would have 2 or 3 in the tank, and they would try and see who would get out of the tank first. They had little tests about they wanted to try and keep their temperature up so that they wouldn't have to get out of the tank. Fun group. We had great support from Minneapolis as well as Duluth. The faculty there were great. Office of Naval Research played a huge role in what we did, and so did Stearns Manufacturing Company. And then finally, when I came here to San Diego, the Naval Health Research Center also contributed to quite a bit of the work that we did on temperature regulation. So that's about it, folks. Thank you very much.
Bob, you might want to just briefly mention that hypothermia, people can fall into a hypothermic state in hot weather as well. It's not just a cold weather or a cold climate phenomenon.
It's a great point. It's sort of like there's so many things to cover. But for instance, there's been 2 or 3 cases of people coming down with hypothermia in the jungles. All you need is a temperature difference between your body, right, and the environment out there, and your metabolism, and a whole bunch of factors. So it doesn't have to be like that picture of you there, Dave, in the back, in the snow and all that. No, you can get it actually in your house. You can get it in, like I mentioned, in the jungles as well. As long as there's that temperature difference, it might take a while. It might not be half an hour. It might not be 2 hours, but it can occur as long as you have that heat transfer difference. And that's a great point, Dave, because you actually little old people get it in their house because there's a temperature difference. The house is a little bit cool, and they're over there. Their metabolism is not as great. Maybe they're on medication or something. They're sedentary, and then all of a sudden you're into a hypothermic situation. Great point, Dave.
Thanks for watching this Minnesota Rovers presentation. If you want to see more, please click on the link to our channel or the subscribe button below. Thank you.